This afternoon, I'm going to talk about internal controls, and it doesn't sound like the most exciting topic for Thursday afternoon, but it's something that we've been requested to do it for some of your veteran members for a year now, and we've tried to get it on last year's agendas, and gosh, your agendas as auditors are just so full. We never run out of topics for you. There are so many hats that you wear that we just haven't been able to get it on the agenda. It's taken us this long, and we did finally promise it that we would do it this spring. And we looked back, and really we have not talked about just internal controls without making it a concentration on fraud or segregation of duties or something like that, or some kind of audit status update on your findings and ARCs. Since 2001, that presentation was given by Bruce Hartman, long before he was state examiner. But that's how intimidating this topic is for even us. It's really a challenge to talk about, but it's so very important. And so I've struggled with it for a few reasons, and I'll kind of go over some of those as we go through our discussion today. But I am sorry for the delay, and I do hope that if you're staying in the auditor's office, you find this really valuable. If you're leaving the auditor's office, I hope you are able to do some of this before you leave the office, give you a better comfort level, and give a good platform for the person that's going to be following you. And really, no matter where you go, this discussion is applicable. It doesn't matter what the function is that you're trying to accomplish or carry out. It doesn't matter what the organization is that you're working in. This is applicable. So let's go ahead and get started. How many of you, by a show of hands, can say that you are reasonably certain that your office operates in a way that your goals are being reached, that every report or financial information that you hand out is materially correct, and that you comply with laws and regulations? Show of hands. What makes you be able to say that? Usually, internal controls. It's what gives you the confidence to know you're okay. You're taking responsibility in a way that is okay, and that you're serving the people the way that you said you would when you came into office. And for those of you, I know you take it very seriously, and really when you think about it, did the voters that elected you do so because they thought you would make sure things were done right? I think they did. Even if they didn't know you, that's what they thought you were there to do. And so the only way that you can make certain is by having controls in place. And it really gives you a way that you can explain exactly how you're certain, you're reasonably certain things are going right. They're being handled correctly. And you can show people, you can show them the documentation of controls. And so that's kind of what we're going to work on today, so that you have a comfort level with the terminology and the verbiage and how the documentation would work if you wanted to put some in place and formalize it a little bit more. And also those things that have maybe come up in your audit. I know many of you received an audit finding related to the internal controls over the schedule of expenditures of federal awards, the CFA schedule. So, and that was a result of not quotas. I know that was the rumor. It was really the result of the fact that we were not performing our federal audits in the proper manner. We were doing the testing that we felt was required to give the level of assurance that's required, but there's an actual process that we were required to do, and we were called on it. And when we started doing it the way that's required, instead of saying, we're not going to rely on controls, we're going to assess control risk high, and we're just going to do a lot of substantive work. Well, that's all fine, but when we assessed control risk at high, because we didn't have any comfort level with the controls, we didn't document any significant deficiencies. The feds require that we gain the understanding of your controls and we actually test them, even if we don't think that we can rely on them. So when we tested them, we had the documentation that shows that the controls were either not designed properly or they were designed just fine, but people weren't carrying them out. And when that happened at the county level, we had that documentation, the only way you can say, you're required then to report it. So that's what resulted in a lot of you getting that internal control finding. And I think as we are more and more required to use a risk-based approach in using tests of controls in your offices, you're going to find more and more areas where we might have to have these kinds of reports. So I want you to have a good handle on controls. I think we kind of understand controls, but it's kind of a loosey-goosey term. You know, it's hard to wrap your head around it sometimes. So, but one of the things I wanted to point out is that really your internal controls, they combat fraud, but they also combat mistakes that are not found and corrected. So it does both. We usually talk about internal controls in terms of fraud, and a lot of times you see this triangle. This is the Creasy triangle. Mr. Creasy developed this triangle, and this slide shows that really these three items are present in every fraud. You have a pressure or some kind of need. The person also has to have an opportunity, and they have to be able to rationalize that this is fair, they aren't paid enough, they are going to borrow it and pay it back. You know, however they have to explain it to themselves to make it all right that they do this. We normally do not have a fraud if we can eliminate one of those elements. But we can't do a lot about the pressures people feel. You know, there's medical necessities, there's, you know, children going through a divorce, or there's, you know, there's a problem at home, or, you know, all kinds of things that we can't control. We can't control usually whether the person will be able to rationalize it or not. Because the more pressure there is, the more they probably are going to find a way to rationalize it. But what we can control is the opportunity, and that's what internal controls do. They either prevent the opportunity or they detect the fraud, hopefully early, and they also detect errors and omissions, hopefully while they're still small. And so really your internal control system should be designed and it should be implemented to prevent this opportunity portion of the fraud triangle. This is the reason I struggle with giving this presentation, and I think it's what you struggle with. We talk about internal controls and then we find it really difficult to go back and take action because it's really overwhelming and all-encompassing. And yeah, we talked about these key words, but where do we start? And so just want to reassure you that internal control systems are not uniform. I can't give you the magic checklist of things to take back to your office. And it's difficult because they're really not something you can lay your hands on at all times. So even though they're not rocket science, in order for them to be effective, they have to be more than just in your mind as management. It has to be a little more formal than that. So these are the things that we're going to kind of cover today. We're going to talk about the understanding of internal control structures, and in doing that, we're going to categorize the 3 objectives that we think you have, the categories of objectives that you have, also the 5 components of internal control systems, and this is something that we learned a long time ago in something called a COSO report. COSO is a Committee on Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission. Sounds like something out of the Bourne Identity, doesn't it? Nobody knows who these sponsoring organizations are, and no one cares. But they're all called COSO, and they study internal controls, and they put out all the formal information about internal control systems. So that's what we're going to talk about today, so you can go back and sound really lofty and informed, talking about COSO. But it's been around a long time, but they recently did update their report on internal controls and their guidance on internal control systems. And so that's the COSO 2013 report. It didn't change a lot, still has the same 5 components and the 3 categories of objectives, but it did kind of expand their guidance on the role that governing bodies play in the internal control system. Before, it was never really spelled out that they played any role. We always talked about management's responsibilities for the internal control systems. But governing bodies have an influence on that. So your council, your commissioners do have an influence in your county and all the offices. So that's kind of been brought in now, no matter what the industry is, whether it's a government or a business. The board of directors or whatever governing body they have has a role. They also adjusted it for our own increased dependence on our IT systems. And they sort of brought that into the internal control discussions a little bit more. And then finally, they introduced 17 new principles, they call them, that are related to each of these 5 components, or one of these 5 components. And the new principles, I wouldn't normally get into that because it's, that's really getting into it kind of a detailed level. But I think they really are kind of common sense things, and they also serve to clarify the components. And the components, the 5 components, that's what I want you to leave here with today, so that you don't think of it as a checklist. You don't think of it as what you're doing for Board of Accounts. This is what you're doing to assure your voters that they elected the right person who's making sure things are being done right. And we have had lots of frauds. So we'll talk a little bit about implementation, that action I want you to take when you leave here at some point. I know you got settlement to do when you get back, but after that, maybe. And then as time permits, we'll also talk about some fraud examples, because I think it really, you think maybe it's not a big deal because it happens to everyone else except in your office, but I do think we don't want it to happen to you before you take it seriously. So we're going to talk about some fraud examples that we've had in our audit reports. And that's the most interesting part, so hopefully we get to that. COSO gives us a definition of internal controls. And I'm going to start here because it is something that's hard to wrap your head around. And what it says is an effective system of internal controls requires that each of the 5 components and the 17 new principles are present and functioning, and the 5 components operate together in an integrated manner. And they also tell us that a major deficiency exists if the county cannot conclude that these are met. Now, the last point really brings out that internal control is management's responsibility. It's not Board of Accounts as auditors' responsibilities. It's also not that Board of Accounts can be your control. It's not valid to say, well, Board of Accounts didn't tell me anything was wrong. It's your responsibility to monitor and find out what's wrong and correct it. So we can't be part of your internal control system. We have to be independent and outside of that as your auditors. We will always help you. we can make recommendations. It's kind of difficult to do that from the office if we don't know how your office operates and all the mechanics and the people involved and all of that. But sometimes the field examiners can give you some recommendations. And when it comes to things like the CFA schedule and some of that, we commonly, Debbie's given many trainings on grants and keeping a set of grant information for each grant that comes through, and when you develop the fund, capture that information so you have it for the CFA schedule and so on, and we can continue to do things like that, and we will. This little picture is called the COSO Cube, and I'm just trying to give you as much visualization or tools that I can to make it a little more concrete when we talk about controls. So the first yellow layer, that top section, goes over the 3 categories of objectives that you have, the operations, reporting, and compliance. Then down the front of the cube, you see that each horizontal slice is one of the 5 components. And then on the right-hand side, you can see that it talks about entity, operating unit function, and so on. So it's really across the entire entity, county, including some of your third-party vendors that play important function or do an important function for you because you've contracted that out. So it's all encompassing. Let's talk a little bit about these objectives, these 3 categories of management objectives. Operations, obviously, those are your goals for the office. They're related to things like customer service, providing on-time tax billing, on-time settlements, having good property records, or whatever your goals may be. When maybe you had them in your platform when you were running for office. Maybe you sit down each year and think about what improvements you guys think you can make within the office. But whatever those operational type goals are. You also have reporting objectives because you're the fiscal officer. You're responsible for the financial reporting. But this doesn't just have to be like the gateway financial statements. This could be W-2s to the employees. Those need to be complete and accurate and timely. Budgetary information for the county council. Those kinds of things too. That all is encompassed in the financial reporting objectives. And then the compliance objectives, obviously, you have areas where you know it's important for you to stay within certain laws and regulations, and that you want to be able to do that. So you have those objectives as well. And these objectives are really affected by, and they affect each of the 5 components. And that's why you can't really slice through the cube without hitting any of the other elements. We're going to spend more time probably talking about these 5 components that are down the front of the cube. They are all interrelated, and they cross the entire county government. I will say sometimes you can look at controls just within your office, and sometimes you have to touch other things, vendors, third-party vendors, or other offices, governing bodies that also affect your office. So, and in your case, the auditor and treasurer function really kind of have to be looked, some of those treasury functions have to be looked at in totality. And I will say that's part of what we talked about with the treasurers at their spring district meeting, and we all know what a fiasco that was, and I apologize. I think I made the decision after that I would never tell the treasurers anything first. So next time we'll just wait till auditors conference, and then their conference is in August, so we'll hit them next. I apologize if you flip-flop between auditor and treasurer, but that might just be the way it goes. So, yeah, that didn't go so well. And we'll talk a little bit about that and try to straighten that out later. Just keep in mind as you look at the cube could be flipped over different ways. This is not an order of these components. It's just a list. There's, they all interact all over the place. You might have monitoring activities that send you back to risk assessment activities and so on. So you don't really have to take them in order, and everything affects everything when it talks about internal control. But the first one we're going to talk about is the control environment. And the reason we're going to talk about this first is that the control environment acts as the foundation for your internal control system. It's easy to say it's a set of standards and processes, but it encompasses everything from your physical environment, includes all your performance measures, and if you give out rewards for performance and incentives and those kinds of things. Ultimately, this is what everyone has always talked about as tone at the top. That's the most important part of the control environment, is the tone at the top. But really, control environment incorporates everything from your floor plan of your office on up. And so what we're going to talk about, we'll give examples of this and we'll go through things, but the most important thing I want you to remember about the control environment is that the attitudes of management and the attitudes of those charged with governance, those are your governing bodies, is always going to be the most important part of the control environment. And that no matter what else happens, no matter how you lay out your office or what security measures you put in place, employees will never rise above the attitude that you as management have about internal controls. If you don't think they're important, if you say, well, this time I'm not going to approve that, just do it without me. Or if you sign off and they know you just sign off and don't look at a reconcilement, or you don't review what they've put in front of you, they know internal controls are not important. And if you're going to circumvent them, they will circumvent them. Because you have just said time is more important than this control. You didn't verbally say it, but your actions said it. So they will never rise above it, so that means you have to stress how important it is to you that things are done right. And I think most of you do that on a regular basis, even if you don't formalize it, but just remember that at those times when you're really tired and you don't feel like reviewing it, don't just sign off. Say, I'm going to delegate to you because you are very capable of reviewing this yourself, or have so-and-so review it thoroughly and sign off for me. You're not circumventing the control. You're placing a responsibility on someone that you're allowed to delegate to. They carry out functions for you all the time. So let's just try to think about those types of things. We won't spend as much time on risk assessment, but this is a really important element that I think we don't formalize enough. Risk assessment requires management to consider the impact of possible changes in the external environment as well as within the county offices and in the county that could render an internal control ineffective. That means something could go wrong. And so those are the things that we want to think about and identify and analyze, and then develop whatever response we're going to do to cover that risk. A lot of organizations use risk-based approaches when they go after any function, whether it be internal controls, whether it's an audit. We use risk-based approaches when we come into audit. And what it does is using a risk-based approach allows you to apply your resources where you have the greatest risk. It makes sense. We can't cover everything. We can't do 100% of everything, but let's place our resources where we think things could go wrong, where we have exposure. So that's kind of how you do that, and we'll walk through some examples of that later. Control activities. This is what we always think about as internal controls. This used to be our internal controls. Before COSO, this is what we said was internal controls. And I've been around long enough that COSO was new to me at one point in time. So, but it has been around a long time. And these, the control activities are established through policies and procedures, and they are what you use to mitigate risks. And these are usually what we just went through on the risk analysis part as your risk responses. Okay, these are the control activities. They're the policies and procedures you put in place. They can be preventative or they can be detective in nature. They can be manual or they can be automated processes, policies, procedures. And it does include segregating incompatible duties. This is where I went wrong with the treasurers. Think about the quietus process. The quietus process, the quietus and application to pay, for those of you who've been around long enough to know that it was a paper form, it was a 4-part form, no, 4 or 5, I can't remember. There's a lot of parts. You filled it out. When a person came in with money, you filled it out. You gave it to the person took that quietus and application to pay with their money to the treasurer. The treasurer filled out their part, kept a part. They sent the person, they kept the money, they sent the person back to you, and then you knew that they actually did pay the treasurer. And they finally left with one part. So that was a lot of back and forth. And some counties do this because auditor treasurer tend to be kind of close to each other, and it works for them. For the department heads coming in with their report of collections, this works for them. But keep in mind, that was the manual process. You may have automated parts of that communication back and forth with the auditor and treasurer's office. So it may be within your system that you know, okay, treasurer's posted, I can see it on the computer. I can't post it myself, but I can see on the computer, treasurer's gotten the money. I can go ahead and hit post on my side into the funds ledger. It may be automated. It may not be. But that was the part where we went wrong, because everybody automatically went back and thought, oh my gosh, we got to have the quietus forms and we got to start walking these things back and forth so that we in the auditor's office don't touch the money when the department heads come in with their deposits. Well, it's not an automatic thing. Just think about, I just want you to have some discussions about how you were doing things, and were you properly segregating the duties of collecting the cash and posting the records. You don't want the treasurer posting in your funds ledger, and the treasurer does not want you to have their cash. But you can put whatever procedures in place to segregate those two things and make sure that you don't post without the treasurer actually taking in the money, and the treasurer doesn't take in the money without you posting. So you can have whatever kind of communications that are either automated or emailed or electronic or on paper that you want to have. Yes?
Wouldn't that be the same when they're telling us that we have to receipt the money in for the tax deed and the recorder instead of them getting the money first and then post it on them and then bring it back to us?
No. Okay, her question is, she has a legitimate question that she says, isn't that the same as when they have to receipt the money in the auditor's office for the tax deeds, rather than the recorder's office getting the money first. You do have to have proper controls, but the proper control is not to say, well, I'm not going to receipt it in the auditor's office. I'm going to go ahead and issue the tax deed as the court ordered me to do, and you go pay the recorder. Or write the check to the recorder, but I won't have a record of it. I'll just hand the check to the recorder. Well, that's how things get lost. That's why you have to have that audit trail. That's why the auditor was always the first part of the quietus. They filled it out, and you would know if the money never made it to the treasurer's office. You fill out a receipt so that the recorder knows that the money made it, and you issue the tax deed directly to the recorder so you know it gets recorded, and they know you got the money. So yes, it somewhat does work the same in that, although it's not our favorite to have the auditor's office be the cash collection point because we would prefer the treasurer to have it, but we will comply with the law and still develop internal controls, either automated or manual, to try to have that. And when we just say, we'll make the check out to the recorder and we'll make sure it gets there, we just circumvented controls. Because if they're going to pay the recorder, they need to pay the recorder directly and get a receipt from the recorder. But the statute doesn't allow us to do that. So we have to put in the best controls we can put in and still comply with the law. And that's why we said we really can't support the other. Now I realize there are mail-in things, documents with payments that come in, and you need to then assess what good controls can we have given that circumstance that they're not going to put the document in one envelope and the payment in the other and hope that both get there. And so, you know, we have to see what controls can we have. Well, let's have two people, like a person opens the mail in front of the other person and the other person documents what checks came in while the other person opens the mail and takes the remittances out or the documents out. And they match them up so that there's not, you know, there has to be collusion in order to be a fraud. Two people have to agree to take the money and split it, basically. So we try to have the best controls that we can given that the process, and still comply with the statute, because we don't want to tell you to not comply with the statute. But at the same time, we also have to give you some examples of what are good controls and not recommend a process that is weak in internal controls. So it's a very good question, very good question. Information and communication is our next component that we're going to talk about. This really, you know, there's a lot of things that go into this. You need to consider the volume of information that's being passed around, the sources of that information. Is it quality information? Are you overloaded with unimportant information? So when you do get something important, you're not going to look at it. How complex are the processes? Because that can determine how much communication you really have to have and what kind of detailed information you have to have. Thinking about technological advances in communication. The little picture is not a technological advance. And then also the fact that we now have a lot more interaction with our third-party vendors, and we count on them to do some of the functioning for us. And so we have to bring that into our consideration as well. And what I will say is that, you know, if you have a communication system like this picture at the bottom, if you do your little risk analysis, what could go wrong? Well, there might not be anybody at the other end of the can. The string might not be tight enough that you can hear properly. Both people might be talking at the same time, so nobody's listening. You could have some problems. So you think about those risks, and so you think, then common sense tells you, well, we got to have some controls and say, well, you be at the other end of the can at 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock so that we can deliver information back and forth. And I will be there too. Or maybe we have some monitoring to make sure that we both got the information communicated correctly. We go back and reconcile, make sure we both heard the same thing. So that sort of tells you the importance of information communication. And then the last component is, that we're going to talk about is the monitoring activities. This is really, really important, and it's probably the part where we think we're done. But you're never done. It's a big old cycle, and everything keeps affecting another component, and you go back and forth as you think about it. And that's how you end up improving processes over time. Monitoring activities can be things that are built into your system, and those are the ongoing evaluations that you see on the left side of the slide. And that really gives you the most timely feedback when you're monitoring. There are other things that you can do that are called the separate evaluations. They are monitoring activities that are conducted with a specific period. Maybe they're quarterly activities where you run budget to actual and see how you're doing and how much money you have left in the budget. Or maybe there's something that you monitor, some report you review after each payroll is run to make sure that that's, proper before you print the checks and get them ready to go. So those are separate evaluations. And the frequency of the separate evaluations really depends on, it depends on the risk that you have related to this. Is it, if something went wrong, would it be really big or maybe not so big of a deal? Or also, how likely is that to go wrong? Is that to happen? And so those can affect the frequency. Also, if you have other ongoing monitoring activities that are built into the system, how reliable are those? If those are pretty reliable, maybe you don't have to do your separate evaluations very frequently. You might do them annually instead of every week. So that's our 5 components. That's what I want you to leave with today. I want you to have a good comfort feeling about those elements and the way that you can apply those in your office and think about those things. How does that really happen in my office? What's that really mean in my office? In order to kind of give some clarity to those 5 components, we're going to go through the new 17 principles that they've given us in the COSO 2013. So if you go back and take this back and actually apply it to some of your significant areas, you can say you're COSO 2013 compliant. We talked about the COSO cube, but we didn't really show on that picture those 17 new principles. And that's because they really relate to the 5 components that were down the front. So they're really part of those 5 slices that you saw on the cube. And when we said we defined an effective internal control system, we said that the 5 components and these 17 principles had to be present and functioning in order to have an effective internal control system. But even in the COSO, they are not required. The 17 principles, it is possible that maybe it's not applicable. But I think you'll find that they're really common sense, and so most of the time they will be. But when push comes to shove, they're absolutely not required. The first 5 of the 17, like we said, control environment's your foundation. So the first 5 of these 17 are all related to the control environment. And the language of this might sound a bit lofty and formal, but I do think it lends itself to really being specific, and that should help you to get the point of this component, and that's the important part. So the first one, the county demonstrates a commitment to integrity and ethical values. It sounds so easy, but you have to think about all the things. It's nothing you do, I know, of course, but it might be something that the commissioners do. Some of them, they don't even look at the claims docket. They kind of look at the bottom line. And away they go. They sign and away they go. Others of them will listen to the items you point out, but they don't pay much attention to everything else. And then others of them are tough. I mean, they're going line by line, asking questions. But each of those things sends a message about how important they think that review is. And, you know, they just sign it off, or do they think it's important to have some integrity and make sure these things are really right? Governing boards have to demonstrate independence from management and exercise oversight of the internal control system. So are they actually involved and engaged in their duties as governing boards, or maybe not so much? Many times I've heard the auditor runs the county. And you do because it needs to be run. But, you know, that's part of it. They're supposed to be engaged in this and be a helper, be supportive of the office holders, make sure we're going the right direction as a county as a whole. They have a different perspective than the office holders concerned about the office. They're supposed to be looking at the whole picture and keeping that in mind and reminding office holders, no, 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 don't go out that way, we're all going this way. Helping us out. Management establishes with board oversight the structures, reporting lines, and appropriate authorities and responsibilities. I will say in government that's a little bit different. A lot of places the law or there's a regulation or a uniform compliance guideline that actually tells you where, kind of establishes some of the structure and a little bit of the duties and reporting lines for you. But other than that, where the law doesn't, it's up to you to do that as management. The county demonstrates a commitment to attract, develop, and retain competent individuals. I think that's always a goal. And the county holds individuals accountable for their internal control responsibilities. Just like at home, when we were all kids, if there was no consequences, those boundaries might get pushed a little bit. We're all good people, but we still might push the boundaries a bit. So, same as in the office, tone at the top. Risk assessment. This is actually an interesting process, and if you formalize it, I think you will learn a lot from the people that work in your office with you about how similar their thoughts are to what you think, or maybe how different their thoughts are to what you think. But they can really help you. I've heard some people say that when it comes to risk assessment, well, I'm not good at thinking about how people could steal. Well, I think probably that person is fine at thinking about that. They weren't giving themselves enough credit because just because they don't spend a lot of time thinking in those terms. I think they probably just are common sense applying to how procedures should be to safeguard assets, to make sure things are done right. You know, I think they weren't giving themselves enough credit just because they hadn't formalized those thoughts. But the 4 new principles that apply to risk assessment, the first one talks about the county specifying objectives with sufficient clarity to enable the identification and assessment of risks relating to the objectives. You all have your own goals, and it's just a matter of how you actually communicate the expectations and what are your goals, you know, your platform for the office, and how do you relate those to the staff and the employees so that they understand them, and then they can identify risks to not achieving those goals. What's going to prevent us from achieving it? We don't have enough staff. We don't have enough time. We don't have, you know, you're going to hear a lot of that kind of thing. Well, does that mean they'll take shortcuts? You know, maybe we need to really have a delineated process so that they don't, and that we won't have a problem, and maybe we can still achieve the goal. Or maybe we need to look and see, is our goal reasonable for the staff we have? Both of those things are important. The county identifies risks to achievement of the objectives across the entity and analyzes risks as a basis for determining how the risks should be managed. So once you figure out what could cause you to not achieve your objectives, you figure out what the control activities will be to make sure you do. Simple. County considers the potential for fraud in assessing risks to the achievement of objectives. Fraud analysis is a complete animal in itself. I mean, it is different because you're not just saying, how could we fail or how could things go wrong, but it's how could things go wrong and somebody cover it up. And that's harder to get. It's a more unique discussion, but sometimes a good discussion to maybe have in the office. And the county identifies and assesses changes that could significantly impact your internal control system. You know, you don't just consider it once. You consider it every time there's a change, every time there's a new staff member, every time there's a new change in law. You go through this, but COSO says at least annually you should consider it. And maybe that would be like when you see if you did achieve your goals for last year. What did you accomplish for the last year? What would you put in your state of the office address for the last year? And then build on that with your staff to give them the expectations and goals for the next year so that they can then identify the risks to not achieving those goals with you, and you can continue on with the process. We're almost there, guys. Hang in there. Control activities just has 3 new principles. The county selects and develops control activities that contribute to the mitigation of risks to the achievement of the objectives of management. Basically, you select control activities to make sure that management stays happy, not that SBOA stays happy. If management's happy in the area of internal controls, we're going to hope that's enough for State Board of Accounts because you've looked at it. Where we're not going to be happy is when you don't consider it. Okay. The county selects and develops general control activities over technology to support the achievement of goals. I think you do this without even thinking. You think about what technologies you need to get your job done and to be efficient in your job, and also to be effective in achieving your objectives. And then the county deploys control activities through the policies that establish what is expected and the procedures that put those policies into place. Information and communication. I think this first one's pretty common sense. County obtains or generates and uses relevant quality information to support the functioning of internal control. I think you do that kind of in an informal way. You all know what reports you can rely on and which offices are going to give you a report that you know it'll be wrong every single time. It happens. So even though you formally haven't developed that risk analysis, you know what department's going to send you a payroll that's going to be wrong. Their claims are going to be messed up. They're probably in law enforcement. I've tried to talk to sheriffs. Prosecutors don't want to hear from us, so. The county internally communicates information, including objectives and responsibilities for internal control necessary to support the functioning of the internal control. So, yeah, you communicate. You send back claims. You ask for more documentation. You do all those communications. And then just don't forget that you have external parties. You may have a joint venture that the county is involved in with another county or with a library or the city. You might have, and you may have external vendors who are doing a function for you. So those communications are important too. Your monitoring activities, you want to select, develop, and perform ongoing or those separate evaluations to make sure that the components of internal control are present and functioning, your effective internal control system. And just remember, some are built into your system, so don't forget about those things. You kind of do them because you know you need to do them, but don't forget that counts. That's internal control. And when Board of Accounts comes in and says, well, you know, what's your process for this? Don't forget that the system does some things for you. And that may be a key control. The county evaluates and communicates internal control deficiencies in a timely manner to those parties responsible for taking corrective action, including senior management and the governing boards as appropriate. And just remember to every once in a while, remind your staff that you do want to know if they see something. It's not just a terrorism thing or an anti-terrorism thing. If you see something, say something. All right, here's the part I always struggle with. And honestly, I know this is the part where usually it ends. You learned some things today, you took it back, it sounds great. But you're busy people. Oh my gosh, you're so busy. I so respect what you do. You do a yeoman's job. People don't understand that these are complicated things that you have to deal with. And they make them more complicated all of the time. I respect it, but I think because of those complexities and the volume of things, transactions, and duties that you guys have to carry out, we cannot forget to put this framework in place of policies and procedures to make sure that it gets done right, to make sure we can prove it to the taxpayers we did it right. And so I will do whatever I can do to assist you. And here's what my hope is. I do not think you're going to go back and outline all of your internal control structures. I do not even want you to do that. You have a lot of things going on, but if you can find some time to look at the significant areas, I will be thrilled. If you can be comfortable with the terminology we sort of talked about today and the language, I'll be happy. And you'll be happier because you'll be able to, when those field examiners come in and say, I'm looking at internal controls, I'm trying to understand, I need to know how you do X. I hope you're not intimidated and you step right up and tell them, because that is going to make your report that much better. And it's going to make our job so much easier. And ultimately, it's going to prevent, hopefully, anyone from having to go through a fraud audit, because that is not a fun thing. So what I'm going to recommend this first time is that even though this process is everything affects everything, we're kind of going to take a step-by-step approach first time through, just so we can get a handle on formalizing what we know in our heads is going on. But we're going to formalize it for our employees to some extent, so we do more than just think, we got controls, we got this, we got that. No, we're going to spell it out for the employees. We're going to think about the tone at the top and how we've communicated that. And we're going to maybe do some brainstorming session with the chief deputy about risk assessment. What's the major stumbling blocks that we might find this year? Are they likely? Are they big? If so, what are we going to do about them? What are we already doing about them? Great, we got it covered. So those are your control activities, and you've already talked about your information communication. And then the last thing is just do your monitoring activities and make sure it's working. Just every so often, or maybe something's built into the system that you could give a quality review to, and you would be done, okay? That will give me much satisfaction. You're going to start with documenting your thoughts on the 5 components in significant areas only first. That means cash. Cash is always significant because it's Huge risk. Highly likely that that will be where you have a problem. You also have some really big risks that aren't so likely, like your IT system could crash. Big problem. Maybe not so likely that it happens. What are you doing to mitigate that? You're doing backups. You're taking them off site. You're going to work with your vendor to make sure that's automatic and that's happening. All of those things. And so look at the cash. Look at the things that are important, significant goals for you this year. And if you have any new processes that you're putting in place, do this first. It will help everyone to learn the process. Try to think just when things happen in your office where there might be a risk that is not mitigated by some control. And this is where you identify the risk. You figure out whether it's big, small, likely, not likely. The things that are big and the things that are likely are problems. Those are the things you got to look at to say, ooh, do I need to mitigate that? Because, you know, if it's real likely, it could happen often. Even if it's small, it could build. Or if it's big, maybe it's not so likely, but you still want to do some minimal things to make sure it doesn't happen to you. All right, here's the fun part. We're going to spend just a few minutes talking about some fraud audits that we have issued our reports on, just so that it kind of drives some of these internal control points home of how bad it can get. We issued an audit report on the LaGrange clerk of the circuit court. The clerk was charged a little over $23,000, and this was in just a little over a year that this was taken. Cash receipts were not deposited in this case. We also had where transfers were made from like an old bank account that wasn't used anymore, but it had money in it just for outstanding checks and things that hadn't cleared yet. And that money was then transferred to try to cover where cash receipts were not deposited. We had some just flat out cash shortages that we don't know if those were book entries or mistakes, but we couldn't find them, or if that was where money was actually taken. We had a lot of additional audit costs, and some of the most interesting things that come to light are that this person was president of Clerks Association, very involved, very hardworking person, attended the meetings, knew what to do, got training, and just got caught in some things that resulted in this. The Switzerland County School Corporation audit that we charged the treasurer $1.1 million, which she had taken over a 4-year period, that was a severe damage to that school corporation. If you're from Switzerland County, you know that. I mean, this school corporation was in trouble after this. And this treasurer wrote manual checks to pay personal credit card bills. She used a different check series, and then she would alter the bank statements with a copier. And she was really good at it. And she would show those bank statements and those reconcilements to that board every month for 4 years. She also did some things to adjust disbursement records to make it look different, like you were meeting the budget and those kinds of things. We worked with the U.S. Attorney's Office, and a search warrant was issued for this person's house. And our field staff actually participated in the execution of that search warrant. And when they did that, they found at the treasurer's house credit card statements and documents for the specific accounts that were paid with those manual checks from Switzerland County Schools. They also found Switzerland County School Corporation bank statements that had been altered, check images that had been altered that accompanied those statements that were enclosed. And they did an interview of this lady, and she just said that she had a spending problem. That was the pressure that she had. The U.S. attorney did charge this lady criminally, and civil charges were brought by the school corporation to try to recover some of those monies, but for the most part, she had a lot of things, but that money was spent. Ashland Township, this was a township trustee that was charged like $7,800, and that's not a large dollar amount, but the reason that I wanted to talk to you about this was just because this is a situation where we had audit reports for years that showed that this person kept having unsupported disbursements. So they didn't have, proper receipts or bills for the disbursements. They had travel expenses and office supplies and all kinds of utility bills and things that just weren't supported. Over many audits, same kinds of arcs over and over and over and over again. And finally, they failed to file the annual report on time, failed to file the 100R report, and eventually, we just felt this person was taking a paycheck and not doing the job. So even more so than the $7,800, it was just important to get this person removed from office so that there was somebody else doing the job. And this was the first case that we actually did work with the prosecuting attorney and the Attorney General's office, and they did take it to court, and this trustee was removed from office. She was fined $1 plus court costs, and the judge did require that she forfeit the office. So that was an instance where, it was really not the $7,800. It was just the fact that for years and years and years, this person had never made an effort to correct anything that was going wrong and do the duties that they were required to do. Town of Brownstown is an interesting one. The clerk treasurer was charged $393,000, almost $394,000. The clerk treasurer had overpaid her salary, most of that money, over a 4-year period. That's a lot of money in 4 years. That would help my retirement. They made unauthorized payroll payments she made unauthorized payroll payments to her son for 3 years. She wasn't as generous to her son. That was only a little over $22,000. But she claimed that he was there to develop a website for the town. The town still didn't have a website when we went in. And then to add insult to injury for the town's citizens and taxpayers, the son, who was never really supposed to be an employee of the town anyway, he claimed unemployment after he stopped getting checks. So, a little brazen, I thought, but she was charged for penalties and interest on payroll deposits that weren't made with the IRS and the Department of Revenue. She did leave town during the audit. Like when we came in to do the audit, she left town, and that was October of 2009. And in April of 2010, the sheriff sold her residence for foreclosure. And at that point in time, we did exit with her attorney and issued the report, and she no longer could establish residence in this town because she had moved, and she no longer owned any property in this town to live in because the sheriff had sold her residence, but she did not resign. So we did comment that she was unable to meet the residency requirement to hold office as clerk treasurer. The town of North Judson is interesting only because it's an area you would never think would have that much money in it, but we did end up charging the clerk treasurer $84,000 just because they, over a period of years, they required that cemetery lots be paid for in cash. They would only take cash. And sort of a red flag. I see it back there. Yes. But they also had utility receipts that were not deposited, utility customer deposits that were never receipted into the books. I had a lot of ordinance violations, collections that didn't get deposited. Police department receipts didn't get deposited. Don't think you'd want to steal from them, but there was a lot of equipment purchased that was not able to be located at the town. They had personal expenses that were paid by town checks, and she paid herself without any supporting documentation a few times. So I don't know if she was trying to claim that that was a travel expense or some kind of reimbursement for something she had purchased. And we did go ahead and certify this to the AG and the prosecuting attorney just because everywhere we looked in this town, I mean, you look at all the number of different things that she was able to take. I mean, everywhere we looked, there was money missing in this town. So we've had a lot of experiences lately that were not so pleasant. We would love to not have those going on. But right now, the economy's not so good. And so fraud is pretty prevalent. Financial need is pretty prevalent. None of us are overpaid for the jobs that we do. So it's just something that you, unfortunately, have to be thinking about. So I just want to leave you with a thought. Say, are you going to trust that things are done right, or are you going to make sure that things are done right? And I will appreciate it greatly if you will take some time out of your extremely busy schedules to make sure that it's done right, so you can hold your head high that you did absolutely everything you could for the people who elected you to office, like I know that you always do.